There is a silence older than sound, before the first wave broke against a shore, before the first wind moved through grass that had not yet grown, before the gods looked upon one another and chose their quarrels. There was something else, something vast and patient and without a name, because there was no one yet to name it. The ancient Greeks called her Gaia, and she was not simply a goddess. She was not worshipped from a distance, from temples carved from the stone of her own body. She was not a ruler who commanded armies, nor a trickster who moved through the world in disguise. Gaia was something far more fundamental than any of those things. She was the earth itself, not a symbol of it, not a spirit dwelling within it, but the living, breathing, conscious presence of the ground beneath every foot that has ever walked, and every root that has ever reached downward, searching for water in the dark. She is, in every meaningful sense, the beginning. In Greek cosmology, Gaia emerged from chaos, that primordial, formless state which preceded all things, and the moment she came into being, existence had a foundation. She was the first of the protogenoi, the primordial deities, those ancient powers who were not born so much as simply were. Where chaos was the void, Gaia was the answer to it, solid, real, present. What follows from that first emergence is a story that spans the entirety of ancient Greek mythology, and it is a story that most people have only heard in fragments. We speak of Zeus and his thunderbolts. We speak of Poseidon and the sea. We speak of Athena and Apollo, of heroes and monsters and great wars waged by men who believed the gods were watching. But behind all of it, behind every divine decree, every cosmic battle, every moment of fate and fury in the ancient world, there is Gaia. Older than all of them, more patient than any of them, and, when the moment demanded it, more dangerous than any force that has ever moved through the heavens or the deep. Her domain was not limited to the quiet growing of things, though she was that too. She was the mother of the sky. Oranos, the heavens themselves, she brought forth from her own being. She was the mother of the mountains, of the deep seas. She bore the Titans, those towering first children who would go on to rule the cosmos before Zeus and his generation wrested power from their hands. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. She bore the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants of immense and terrible craft. She bore the Hecatoncheires, beings of 100 hands and 50 heads, whose strength was so overwhelming that even the gods moved carefully around the fact of their existence. Everything that mattered, in the ancient Greek understanding of the cosmos, either came from Gaia or stood upon her. And yet, she is so often the background, the assumed foundation, the presence that the myths pass over in a hurry, eager to get to the drama of the younger gods, the golden palaces, the thunderbolts and love affairs and famous battles. We will not pass over her today, because when you look closely at Gaia, when you follow the full arc of her presence through the mythology, what you find is not a passive, nurturing Earth Mother content to be stood upon. What you find is a being of extraordinary will, a mother who, when her children were imprisoned in her own body by a cruel husband, did not weep. She fashioned a great sickle from her own grey flint, and she acted. A grandmother who, when her grandchildren were swallowed by their father, guided the hand that would end it. A power who, even when all of Olympus had risen and the new order of the gods had been established, would rise again, would send great Typhon against the heavens themselves, because she had not yet finished shaping the world to her will. Gaia forgives slowly, if at all, and she remembers everything, because the earth forgets nothing. Over the course of this documentary, we will move through her story in full, from her first emergence from chaos to the family she built and the suffering she endured, from the great castration of Oranos to the Titanomachy to the final war of the giants. We will sit with the prophecies she gave, for she was also the first oracle, the voice beneath the earth at Delphi before Apollo ever set foot there. And we will explore what she meant to the ancient Greeks, not merely as a myth, but as a way of understanding the very ground they walked on. Take a slow breath. We are going back to the beginning. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine nothing. Not darkness, because darkness is still something. Not silence, because silence is the absence of sound, and absence requires a container. Not even emptiness, because emptiness has edges, and edges imply a shape, and a shape implies a world already in the process of becoming. What the ancient Greeks called chaos was something far more difficult than any of those things to hold in the mind. It was the state before states, the condition before conditions, a kind of infinite, formless potential that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. The word itself, in its oldest usage, did not mean disorder, not the way we use it today, shouting it over noise and confusion. The Greek chaos meant something closer to a vast, yawning gap, a chasm, an opening, and from that opening, in the way that breath eventually fills a set of lungs that have never yet drawn air, something stirred. Gaia came first, or very nearly first, depending on which ancient source you sit with. And it is worth pausing here, because this is one of the quiet pleasures of ancient mythology. The sources do not always agree, and that disagreement is itself meaningful. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century before the Common Era in his Theogony, our oldest and most complete account of Greek divine origins, tells us that after chaos came Gaia, broad-bosomed, the ever-sure foundation of all. He places her second in the order of emergence, before Tartarus, that deep abyss beneath even the earth, and before Eros, the driving force of desire and union that would make all subsequent creation possible. Other ancient thinkers placed her in slightly different sequences, but across all of them, one thing holds constant. Gaia arrives before the gods, before the titans, before the sea has a name, or the sky has a god to carry it. She is there at the very threshold of existence, and her arrival is what makes the rest of the story possible. Think about what that means for a moment. Every temple ever built was built upon her. Every altar raised to Zeus or Hera or Aphrodite rested on her body. The very marble quarried to carve the faces of the gods came from within her. She was not a participant in the divine order. She was the surface upon which the divine order was written. And yet she was conscious. She was willful. She felt. This is the aspect of Gaia that tends to be lost when we reduce her to a symbol. When we speak of Mother Earth as a comfortable, abstract notion, the ancient Greeks did not abstract her. They understood her as genuinely, actively alive. A being with intentions, with grief, with the capacity for extraordinary patience, and, when patience ran out, for wrath that could shake the foundations of heaven itself. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us stay, for now, in those early moments. In the beginning, Gaia was alone in a way that nothing has been alone since. She was the world, and the world was her, and there was nothing outside of that unity to create contrast or meaning. Hesiod tells us that, from herself, parthenogenetically, without partner or union, she brought forth Oranos, the starry sky, so that he might cover her entirely and be a seat for the blessed gods. She brought forth the great mountains, their long ridges, the haunt of the divine nymphs, and she brought forth Pontus, the barren sea, the deep whose waves would eventually cover so much of her surface. Pause with that image for a moment. A being, alone at the dawn of existence, creating the sky above herself, so that there would be something overhead, creating the mountains so that the flatness of her being would have texture, would have peaks and valleys and the sound of wind moving through passes, creating the sea so that the edges of herself would have a border, a place where land became water and the known dissolved into the vast unknown. There is something in this that the ancient Greeks understood at a level deeper than theology. They were a people who lived close to the earth, who farmed its soil, who sailed the sea she had made, who sheltered in the mountain passes. When they looked at the world around them, they were not looking at scenery. They were looking at a body, a living thing that had, in some original and unrepeatable moment, decided to make itself interesting. Now, when Gaia brought forth Oranos, the heavens above, something changed in the nature of the cosmos. Because Oranos looked down upon Gaia, and in looking, desired her, and in desiring her, lay with her. And in that union, the next great generation of being was set in motion. The children that came from Gaia and Oranos were not small things. The first to be named in the oldest accounts were the Titans, 12 of them in the classic reckoning, 6 male and 6 female, Oceanus and Tethys, whose union would produce the rivers of the world and the thousands of ocean nymphs called Oceanids, Hyperion and Thea, from whose line the sun, the moon, and the dawn would come, Coos and Phoebe, grandparents of Apollo and Artemis, Cronus, the youngest and the most cunning, and Rhea, whose suffering would eventually give the world Zeus. But the Titans were not all that Gaia brought forth in those early unions. There were also the Cyclopes, 3 of them bearing names that tell you exactly what they were. Brontes, whose name means thunder, Steropes, lightning, Argers, brightness. These were not the dim, lumbering cave dwellers of the Odyssey, the creatures that Odysseus would one day outwit with a sharpened stake and a name that meant no one. These original Cyclopes were craftsmen of incomprehensible skill, beings who understood the deepest mechanics of the natural world, who would eventually forge for Zeus his thunderbolts, for Poseidon his trident, for Hades his helm of darkness. They were power in its most concentrated, most purposeful form, and they came from Gaia's body. And then there were the Hecaton chairs, 3 of them as well, Cottus, Briareos, and Gyges, each with 50 heads, each with 100 hands. The ancient sources describe them matter-of-factly, with the calm of people reporting something that needed no elaboration, because the terror was self-evident. Beings whose reach extended in 100 directions at once, whose voices, when all 50 heads spoke, was something the cosmos itself had no precedent for. Gaia loved all of these children. This is important. This is the detail that drives everything which follows, the engine beneath all of the great conflicts and upheavals of the ancient Greek mythological world. Gaia loved her children, all of them, the beautiful and the monstrous alike, the Titans who would rule and the Cyclopes who would build, and the 100-handed giants whose existence defied easy comprehension. Oranos did not. The sky god, looking down at the Cyclopes and the Hecaton chairs, felt something that the ancient sources describe in different ways across different texts, but which amounts, in every version, to the same thing: fear. Fear of what he had helped to create. Fear of children whose power he could not fully measure and therefore could not fully control. And so he acted on that fear in the cruelest way a father can act. He took the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, and he pushed them back into Gaia's body, into the earth, into a darkness beneath the surface of the world. He imprisoned them within their own mother. He refused to let them see the light he himself carried, and he left them there. What Gaia felt in that moment is something the myths do not describe in long passages of lament. The ancient storytellers understood that some kinds of grief do not require eloquent expression. They require action. She endured the pain of carrying her imprisoned children within her. A mother carrying not new life, but trapped life. Not the hopeful weight of pregnancy, but the unbearable weight of confinement. She felt, Hesiod tells us, a great wrenching strain. And she began, quietly and with great intention, to plan. She formed a sickle. Grey flint, some sources say, adamant in others. That impossible, unbreakable, divine material that shows up at the cutting edges of mythology whenever something is about to be permanently, irrevocably severed. She fashioned it inside herself, in the dark where Uranos could not see, and then she spoke to the children she still had access to. The Titans, still free, still above ground, still capable of hearing their mother's voice. She told them what their father had done. She told them what she needed. And she asked which of them was willing to act. The Titans looked at one another, and then Cronus, the youngest, the most cunning, the one whose name may carry within it the oldest traces of time itself. Cronus stepped forward. He was willing. The sky was about to be changed forever. There is a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with fearlessness. It is the courage of someone who has looked clearly at a situation, who has measured the risk, felt the weight of it, understood exactly what they are stepping toward, and who moves forward anyway, not because they are not afraid, but because the alternative is to remain still while something unbearable continues. Cronus had that courage, or something close enough to it that the distinction barely matters. He took the sickle from his mother's hands. That great grey blade, formed in darkness and patience, shaped by a grief that had been building since the first of her children, was pushed back into her body and told to disappear. He took it, and he carried it, and he waited. This is another detail worth staying with, the waiting. Because Cronus did not act impulsively. He did not charge the sky in open defiance. The myths describe him concealing himself, positioning himself carefully, waiting for the moment when Uranos came to lie with Gaia, as he had always done, descending from the heavens to cover the earth in the ancient, intimate way of sky meeting ground. And when that moment came, Cronus reached out of the darkness with the sickle his mother had made, and he castrated his father. The ancient Greeks did not soften this. Hesiod describes it plainly, even clinically, in the way that ancient mythological literature sometimes achieves a strange, calm precision around acts of enormous violence, as though the enormity of the event requires steady language to carry it, the way a very heavy object requires a very stable surface. Cronus severed what he severed. He threw what remained into the sea behind him, not looking back. And the cosmos changed. First, from the blood that fell from Uranos onto the earth, onto Gaia herself, came new life, as Gaia's body had always transformed what entered it. The Erinyes rose from that blood. The Furies, we call them in the Roman tradition, those relentless, implacable goddesses of vengeance and retribution who would pursue blood guilt across generations, who would hound murderers and oath-breakers and those who wronged their own kin with a persistence that nothing in the mortal world could outrun. They were born from an act of violence against a father, and they became the eternal punishment for violence against family. There is a logic in that, of the kind that mythology specializes in. A meaning embedded in an origin that explains not just where something came from, but why it is the way it is. From that same blood came the Gigantes, the giants, in their oldest and truest form. Not the lumbering, foolish creatures of later popular imagination, but an army of immense, fully formed warriors who sprang from the earth already carrying spears, already clad in armor, already oriented toward conflict. They were, from the very first moment of their existence, soldiers in a war that had not yet been declared. Gaia had not forgotten what was coming. She never forgot what was coming. And from that blood came also the Meliai, the nymphs of the ash trees, those gentle, long-lived spirits who would tend to the world's trees and be connected, in later tradition, to the rearing of Zeus himself. Even in the violence of that moment, Gaia's body produced things that nurtured. But it is what happened in the sea that has captivated human imagination for longer than almost any other image in the ancient world. The severed form of Uranos, cast into the water, drifted, and around it the sea began to foam. that white, churning, luminous foam that forms where something powerful meets the open water, and the two push against each other. Aphros, in Greek, sea foam, and from within that foam, gathering it around herself like a garment, like the first and most extraordinary garment ever worn, a figure rose, Aphrodite, born not from a mother's womb, not from a father's intention, born from the confluence of an act of violence and the patience of the deep water, beauty emerging from rupture, desire rising from the place where power was undone. She came ashore, the ancient sources tell us, first at Cyprus, and flowers grew beneath her feet as she walked, and the world was, from that moment, in possession of something it had not had before, the organizing principle of longing. There is so much in that image that deserves quiet contemplation. The Greeks, who thought carefully about the origins of things, were making a profound statement by giving beauty this particular birth. She did not come from harmony. She did not come from a loving union of equals. She came from the sea foam around a wound. She arrived in the world accompanied by the graces and by Himeros, longing, desire, the ache of wanting, because those were, in the Greek understanding, her natural companions. Beauty and longing are inseparable. You cannot fully perceive one without feeling the pull of the other. And Gaia had made all of this possible. Not by intending Aphrodite, perhaps. The gods of this moment are not calculating every consequence, but by setting in motion the chain of events that the cosmos required. She had been the ground. She had been the grief. She had made the sickle. And now the world had the furies, the giants, the ash nymphs, and the goddess of love, all born in a single moment of irreversible change. Meanwhile, Uranus, wounded, displaced, no longer the great covering sky in the same intimate way, retreated. He did not disappear from the mythology entirely. He would linger at its edges, nursing what had been done to him. And he would do something that fathers in mythology so often do when their power is taken from them. He would prophesy. He told Cronus, with the clarity of someone who has seen the shape of the future and cannot resist the bitterness of announcing it, that his own children would do to him exactly what he had done, that the pattern would repeat, that the violence of succession was not an aberration but a rhythm, and that Cronus had just stepped into the second beat of it and would live to hear the third. Cronus heard this, and he did not disbelieve it. And here is where the story takes on one of its most human qualities, because what Cronus chose to do with that prophecy was not to break the cycle, but to attempt to stop time, to hold the future at bay through the most direct method available to him. He swallowed his children, as each child was born to him, and his consort Rhea, herself a Titan, herself a daughter of Gaia. He took them and swallowed them whole, Hestia first, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. 5 children, 5 gods of what would become the Olympian order, consumed by their own father and sealed inside him, alive and divine and unable to act. Rhea's grief over this is one of the quiet tragedies that runs beneath the louder drama of the Titanomachy. Each birth that should have been a beginning became immediately a loss. She bore a child. She watched it taken. She bore another. And all the while, the prophecy hung over everything like weather that has not yet broken. It was Gaia who intervened. When Rhea was pregnant with her 6th child, the one who would become Zeus, she went to her mother and her father, to Gaia and the sky, and she asked what could be done, how this could end differently, whether there was any path through the prophecy that did not simply confirm it. And Gaia told her. She instructed Rhea to travel to Crete, to the island's deep and hidden places, to a cave on the slopes of Mount Aegaeon or Mount Ida, depending on which tradition you follow. There, in that sheltered dark, she was to give birth in secret. And in place of the child, she was to wrap a great stone in swaddling clothes and present it to Cronus as though it were the newborn. Cronus, whose hunger was habit by now, whose fear had made him into something that consumed without examining what it consumed, swallowed the stone without question. And on Crete, hidden in the deep earth, in the body of Gaia herself, Zeus grew. The nymphs of the island fed him. The Corets, divine guardians, clashed their weapons together whenever the infant cried, so that the sound would not reach his father's ears. And Gaia held the secret inside herself, the way she had once held her imprisoned children, but differently now, not in suffering, in anticipation. She had put the pieces in place. She had counseled the mother, sheltered the child, prepared the ground for what was coming, because she already knew what was coming. She had known since before the sickle, since before the blood and the sea foam, since before Uranus had first looked down at his children with fear rather than love. Gaia was the earth, and the earth does not hurry, because the earth has no reason to. Everything arrives, in the end, at the surface. There is something extraordinary about a god who begins as a secret, not enthroned in heaven, not announced by thunder or heralded by lesser beings, prostrating themselves in recognition of divine power. Zeus began in a cave, in the dark, in the body of an island that was itself part of the body of Gaia. He began hidden and small, and entirely dependent on the kindness of nymphs and the noise of guardians clashing bronze so that his crying would not give him away. And yet something in that origin, that particular combination of concealment and protection, of being the thing the world was not yet ready to know about, gave Zeus a quality that none of the titans who came before him possessed. He did not inherit his power. He did not receive it from a father who simply handed the cosmos down. He would have to take it, and the taking would require strategy, patience, alliance building, and ultimately a war of such magnitude that the ancient Greeks described it, shaking the earth to its foundations, and the sea boiling in its depths. But first, the stone had to be returned. When Zeus had grown, and the myths do not linger on the years of his growing, because mythology is not interested in childhood so much as in the moment of becoming, he made his way into the world with the help of those who understood what he represented. Some traditions say it was Metis, the titaness of wisdom and cunning, who helped him prepare a potion, or an emetic, or a mixture of wine and mustard that he gave to his father. Other traditions are less specific about the method, and more interested in the result. What matters, in every version, is that Cronus was made to disgorge what he had swallowed. The stone came first, the same stone that Rhea had wrapped and presented to him in place of her son. It was later placed at Delphi, at the navel of the world, where it would become one of the most sacred objects in all of Greek religious life. The omphalos, the center point, the place where the deception that saved the king of the gods had been made physical and permanent. And then, one by one, the gods came up. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, 5 siblings, divine and fully formed, released from the darkness of their father's body into the light of a world they had never seen. They emerged not as infants but as gods complete in their power, because time inside Cronus had not diminished them, only delayed them. They were ready, and they were, every single one of them, ready to fight. What followed was 10 years of war. 10 years, according to Hesiod, of unrelenting conflict between the Olympians, Zeus and his freed siblings, joined by allies gathered carefully over the course of the struggle, and the Titans, those great first children of Gaia and Uranus who had ruled the cosmos through the long age before this one. The Titans held Mount Othries as their stronghold. The Olympians held Olympus, and between those two peaks, across the breadth of the world, the fighting went on, and the cosmos groaned under the weight of it. It is worth pausing here to understand what was at stake in a way that goes beyond the simply political. This was not a war over territory in any ordinary sense. This was a war over the nature of reality itself, over which order of being would govern the fundamental forces of existence. The Titans represented one age of the world, and the Olympians represented another, and the question of which would prevail was, in the Greek understanding, the question of what kind of universe human beings would eventually be born into. Gaia watched all of this. And here the complexity of her position becomes impossible to ignore, because these were her grandchildren fighting her children. The Olympians were Rhea's sons and daughters, and Rhea was Gaia's daughter. The Titans were Gaia's own firstborn. She had loved them all, and now they were destroying each other across the surface of her body, and the blood of gods was soaking into her soil, and the mountains shook, and the seas churned, and the sky filled with divine fire. There are different ancient traditions about where Gaia's sympathies lay during the Titanomachy. Some suggest she remained carefully neutral, watching and waiting, as was her nature. Others suggest that her deeper loyalty was always to the progression of things, to the turning of ages, to the idea that what must come will come, and that resistance to succession is always, in the end, futile. She had, after all, been the one who sheltered Zeus on Crete. She had been the one who counseled Rhea. She had, in the most literal sense, protected the future king of the gods in her own body. But the war was not going well for the Olympians. 10 years of fighting had produced no decisive resolution, and Zeus, however powerful, had not yet found the thing that would tip the scales. That thing was in the earth. Gaia came to Zeus, or the knowledge came to him, through oracle or dream, or the deep understanding that comes to those who pay attention to the world beneath their feet. And the message was this: the Titans could not be defeated without allies who were currently imprisoned in Tartarus. The Cyclopes, the Hecatoncheires, those children of Gaia and Uranos, whom Uranos had once feared and buried, and whom Cronus, no better than his father in this regard, had kept imprisoned when he came to power. To win the war, Zeus would have to free them. He descended into Tartarus, that deep abyss beneath even the underworld, that primordial darkness that had been among the first things to emerge from chaos alongside Gaia herself. And he killed the guardian, Campe, that terrible ancient creature set to watch over the imprisoned ones. And he opened the prison. The Cyclopes emerged, and they remembered the light, and in gratitude, in the way that beings of immense craft express gratitude, through the making of things that change the world, they gave. To Zeus they gave the thunderbolt, that searing, unstoppable weapon of light and fire and divine authority that would become his signature, the image so associated with him that it became shorthand for divine power itself across millennia. To Poseidon they gave the trident with which he could shake the earth and churn the sea. To Hades they gave the helm of darkness, the helmet that rendered its wearer invisible, that could make the god of the dead disappear entirely from the sight of gods and mortals alike. 3 weapons, 3 brothers. And the war, which had been a stalemate for a decade, began to resolve. The Hecatoncheires fought alongside the Olympians, and what they brought to the battlefield was something the Titans had no answer for. Each of the 300-handed giants could hurl 300 boulders simultaneously. Great rocks torn from the mountains themselves, from Gaia's own bones, weaponized now in service of the generation that would succeed the ones who had imprisoned them. The ancient accounts describe the sky and sea filled with projectiles, the earth shaking continuously, the sound of the conflict reaching places in the cosmos that had never heard anything before. The Titans broke, one by one, and then all at once, the way things that have been under pressure for a very long time sometimes break, not gradually, but in a single moment when the accumulated force finally exceeds what the structure can bear. Zeus drove them down with his thunderbolts, the sky burning with divine fire. The Hecatoncheires bound them in the darkness, and Tartarus, that primordial abyss, that first deep place that Gaia had known from the very beginning of things, became their prison. A bronze wall surrounded it. The Hecatoncheires stood guard, and the age of the Titans was over. The Olympians ascended to their mountain, and the cosmos was redistributed among them in that famous division: the sky to Zeus, the sea to Poseidon, the underworld to Hades, the earth held in common, held always by Gaia. But Gaia was not finished. She had watched the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires freed from imprisonment, and something in that had stirred her, perhaps gratitude, perhaps the simple recognition that the universe had corrected one of its great injustices. But she had also watched her Titan children bound in Tartarus, and whatever satisfaction she may have felt at the turning of the age, something in a mother does not entirely relinquish the grief of children lost to darkness. And she had other children still. Children who had sprung from the blood of Ouranos all those ages ago, when Cronus had thrown the sickle and the sea foam had gathered around a wound. Children who had been born already carrying spears. The giants had not yet had their war, and Gaia, patient as bedrock, ancient as the first morning, had not yet spoken her last word on the shape of the cosmos. She was already preparing the next move. There is a particular kind of love that the world does not have a comfortable name for. It is the love that does not distinguish between the beloved and the self. The love that looks at what has been taken, what has been imprisoned, what has been diminished, and feels the loss, not as an external wound, but as something happening inside the body. Gaia loved her children in this way, all of them. The Titans bound in Tartarus were her firstborn, and their imprisonment was not something she processed as a distant injustice. It was something she felt the way the earth feels, a fissure opening along a fault line from the inside, continuously, without relief. The Olympians had won their war. Zeus sat on his throne. The cosmos had been divided among the new gods with the confidence of victors who believe that what they have settled will remain settled. The sky blazed with divine authority. The sea answered to its new master. The dead passed quietly into the realm of the third brother, and the world, to all appearances, had found its new order. But the earth beneath all of that had not agreed to anything. Gaia had borne the Gigantes, the giants, from the blood of Ouranos, in that violent foundational moment when Cronus had raised the sickle and changed the shape of existence. They had been born, fully formed, fully armed, oriented from their first breath toward conflict. And now, with her Titan children sealed in Tartarus and the Olympians celebrating a permanence that Gaia did not recognize as permanent, the time had come for what those giants had been, in some sense, always waiting to do. What followed is known as the Gigantomachy, the war between the giants and the Olympian gods. And it is, in the full arc of Greek mythology, the last great attempt to overturn the divine order that Zeus had established. It was not a skirmish. It was not a rebellion of the discontented. It was a war that Gaia herself orchestrated, with full understanding of what she was doing and why, fueled by a grief that 10 years of Titanomachy and the subsequent age of Olympian rule had done nothing to diminish. The giants were extraordinary beings. Each one was individual, named, possessed of specific and terrible qualities. Alcyoneus, whose immortality was tied to his native soil. He could not be killed on the ground where he was born, a fact that would matter enormously before the war was done. Porphyrion, the greatest of the giants, who would set his sights on Hera herself during the battle. Enceladus, who in defeat would be buried beneath the island of Sicily, and whose restless turning in his imprisonment the ancient Greeks understood as the cause of volcanic eruption and earthquake. Polybotes, who would be chased across the sea by Poseidon and crushed beneath a piece of the island of Kos, torn from the earth and hurled upon him. Each giant a force, each giant a story, each giant born from Gaia's determination that the cosmos had not yet finished being contested. But Gaia knew something that made the war more complicated than a simple matter of strength against strength. There was a prophecy and Gaia was always aware of prophecies, being herself the original source of prophetic knowledge in the Greek world, the voice beneath the earth at Delphi, before any god had claimed that sanctuary. And this prophecy held that the giants could not be defeated by the gods alone. They could only be killed through the combined effort of a god and a mortal fighting together. Divine power was not sufficient. A human hand had to be part of every killing blow. The gods needed a hero. Zeus needed a son. And here the myth opens into one of its most interesting layers, because Zeus's production of mortal heroes was not simply a matter of divine appetite, though the ancient sources are frank enough about the fact that appetite was certainly involved. It was, in the deeper mythological logic, a preparation, a seeding of the mortal world with beings capable of standing alongside gods in the moments when the cosmic order required defending. Hercules, in the Roman tradition, was the greatest of these, and it was Heracles who would stand at the center of the gigantomachy, moving across the battlefield with his bow and his club, delivering the mortal component of death to giant after giant, making possible what the gods alone could not accomplish. When the war came, it came with everything. The giants tore up mountains and hurled them at the heavens. Pelion was stacked upon Ossa in some traditions, the landscape itself weaponized, geography becoming artillery in the hands of beings who had no other scale of engagement. The gods fought back with their divine weapons. Zeus with his thunderbolts, Poseidon with his trident, Athena, who would claim particular distinction in this battle, with her spear and her divine aegis. Dionysus fought alongside his fellow Olympians, wielding his thyrsus, accompanied by satyrs riding donkeys whose braying, in one of mythology's stranger details, was said to have terrified some of the giants into flight. But it was in the individual combats that the war found its most vivid moments. Porphyrion, the king of the giants, went for Hera during the battle, overcome, some sources say, by a desire that Zeus himself had inspired in him to create a distraction and an opportunity. Zeus struck him with a thunderbolt. Heracles finished him with an arrow. Alcyoneus had to be dragged from his native soil before he could be killed. Heracles physically hauling the immortal giant across the boundary of his homeland, stripping him of his geographical invulnerability, allowing mortality to catch up to him. Enceladus fled, and Athena buried him under Sicily, and the ancient Greeks heard in every eruption of that island's great volcano the breathing of a buried giant whose rage had not cooled. Clytius was killed by Hecate and her torches, or by Heracles, depending on the tradition. Hippolytus fell to Hermes, who wore the helm of invisibility that Hades had lent for the occasion. Gratian was shot by Artemis. One by one, the giants fell, and Gaia, watching, understood that this war too would not go the way she had intended. But Gaia was not done. From somewhere deeper than strategy, deeper than the calculated orchestration of wars fought by children born from divine blood, she reached into the oldest and most primal parts of her own being, and she brought forth something that was not a soldier, not a warrior in any sense that the word had yet been used, but a force of nature in the shape of a living creature, something so vast and so terrible that even the Olympian gods, freshly victorious from the gigantomachy, would flee from it in panic. Typhon. His origins in the ancient sources vary in their details but agree completely in their terror. He was the last great child of Gaia, some say born from her union with Tartarus himself, that primordial abyss, the deep darkness beneath the deep darkness, giving the creature a parentage that was as much geography as biology. He was, in physical terms, described by Hesiod in a passage that reads less like mythology and more like an attempt to describe something genuinely indescribable. From the shoulders of Typhon grew 100 serpent heads. Each head spoke in a different voice, the voice of a bull, the voice of a lion, the voice of a pack of dogs, the voice of fire hissing through stone, the voice of wind through a mountain pass. When all the heads spoke together, the sound was something the ancient sources do not attempt to name, because it was not a sound that had a name. His lower body was great coils of vipers, scaling endlessly against the earth. He breathed fire. His eyes, when they caught the light, were lit with something that looked like divine fire, but was nothing so refined. He moved toward Olympus, and the gods ran. This is one of the most striking moments in all of Greek mythology, and it deserves to be held without rushing past it. The Olympians, Zeus who had defeated the Titans, Athena who had planted giants under islands, Poseidon who commanded the depths of the sea, looked at Typhon coming across the landscape of the world, and they fled. They abandoned Olympus and ran to Egypt in some traditions, transforming themselves into animals to hide from him. Apollo became a crow, Ares a fish, Aphrodite and Eros became fish in the Nile. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, initially retreated. Gaia had, at last, produced something that made the gods afraid. For a time, one of those suspended mythological moments where the outcome hangs genuinely uncertain. Typhon prevailed. In some versions of the myth, he managed to get hold of Zeus's sinews, those divine tendons that gave the king of the gods his strength, and he took them and hid them in a cave in Cilicia. And Zeus lay helpless, unable to fight, dependent on Hermes and Pan to recover what had been stolen from him. But Zeus recovered. Hermes retrieved the sinews. Fate, or the deep structure of things, or simply the particular quality of Zeus's will, something moved against Typhon. Zeus returned to the fight, and what followed was a battle across the entire eastern Mediterranean, the landscape physically transformed by the conflict. Mountains were shattered, rivers were displaced. The sky became a theater of divine fire and serpent breath and thunder, the two forces pushing against each other at a scale that the gigantomachy had not reached. Eventually, Zeus drove Typhon south toward Sicily, and there, with a final gathering of divine power, he buried him. Beneath Mount Etna, the same mountain beneath which Enceladus already raged, and now the volcano breathed with the combined fury of a giant and the last child of Gaia. That tremendous, impossible, hundred-headed final effort of the earth to reclaim what she had lost, to overturn what she could not accept, to push back against the settled order of an Olympian cosmos that had imprisoned her children and redistributed her world without asking her permission. The mountain rumbles still. Gaia had not won. The Olympians remained on their thrones. Zeus remained in his sky. The Titans remained in their Tartarian darkness. But something had been made clear in the sequence of these wars. The gigantomachy, the rising of Typhon, the full arc of Gaia's resistance, that the Greeks understood, and that deserves to be said plainly. The earth does not simply accept what is done to it. It absorbs. It waits. It turns grief into intention, and intention into force. And when it finally moves, it moves with everything it has ever held, everything that has ever died into it, everything that has ever been buried within it, and told to stay quiet. Gaia had spoken in earthquakes and giants, and a creature whose voices were all the voices of the natural world at once. She had spoken as clearly as she was capable of speaking. And, beneath the volcano, the speaking was not entirely over. It simply continued at a different register. The low, constant, geological register of a world that has more to say than any age of gods has yet been patient enough to hear. Not every story of power is told in the language of war. Some of the most consequential forces in human history have made themselves known, not through confrontation, not through the shaking of mountains or the hurling of divine fire across a contested sky, but through something quieter, a whisper at the right moment, a word spoken into the ear of someone standing at a crossroads, uncertain which way to turn. The knowledge that arrives not as thunder, but as a feeling in the body, a certainty that rises from somewhere below thought, below language, below the conscious mind, that spends so much of its energy managing the surface of things. Gaia spoke in both registers. We have spent considerable time with the Gaia of war and grief and tremendous irresistible geological force, the mother who fashioned sickles, the grandmother who sheltered gods in her body, the ancient power who sent giants and a 100-headed monster against the settled order of the heavens because she could not let the imprisonment of her children go unanswered. That Gaia is real and important and deserves every moment of attention we have given her. But she is not the whole of it, because before she was the mother of conflicts, before the first sickle was ever shaped from grey flint in the darkness beneath the world, Gaia was something else, something that the ancient Greeks considered, in certain ways, even more fundamental to her nature than her role as mother of the gods. She was the first voice of prophecy. This is a fact that tends to be overshadowed by the later mythology of Apollo and his oracle at Delphi, that famous sanctuary in the mountains of Phocis where for centuries the Pythia, Apollo's priestess, would sit above a chasm in the earth and breathe the vapors that rose from below, and speak the god's words to the kings and generals and ordinary people who came from every corner of the ancient world seeking guidance. Delphi became so central to Greek religious life, so authoritative, so woven into the political and personal decisions of the ancient Mediterranean world, that it is easy to think of it as Apollo's place from the beginning. It was not. Before Apollo came to Delphi, the sanctuary belonged to Gaia. The ancient sources, including Aeschylus in his Oresteia, preserve this older tradition clearly. The earth spoke there first. The chasm in the rock through which the vapors rose was not a geological curiosity that a god had chosen to make use of. It was a mouth. The earth's own mouth, the place where Gaia breathed upward into the human world, where the knowledge she carried in her deep places, all that had ever died into her, all the ancient information of roots and bones and the slow turning of geological time, found its way into human language. The Pythia was, in the oldest understanding, not channeling Apollo. She was sitting inside Gaia. The transition of Delphi from Earth Oracle to Apollo's sanctuary is handled differently across different ancient traditions. In some versions, Apollo simply arrived and took the sanctuary, establishing his authority over a sacred site that already existed. In others, and this is the version that tends to carry the most mythological weight, there was a serpent, Python, a great serpent or dragoness, who guarded the sanctuary of Gaia at Delphi, who was herself a creature of the earth, born from the mud and moisture of the world after the great flood of Deucalion, and who Apollo killed with his silver arrows before claiming the site as his own. Python, in this reading, was Gaia's guardian, her sentinel at the place where Earth spoke to the human world. And Apollo's killing of Python was not simply a heroic act of monster slaying. It was a transfer of authority. A younger power displacing an older one, a god of light and reason, and the ordered, beautiful forms of art and civilization arriving at the ancient, dark, geological mouth of the earth and saying, "I will speak here now." Even so, the Greeks remembered. The name Python remained attached to Delphi's prophetess. She was always the Pythia. The serpent's name lived on in the title of the one who carried the prophetic voice, as though the earth had insisted on leaving its mark, even in the moment of its displacement. Gaia's prophetic role extended well beyond Delphi. She was understood as the source of oracular knowledge throughout the ancient world. The Earth Oracle was the oldest form of divine communication in the Greek religious imagination, older than the messenger gods, older than the elaborate apparatus of augury and sacrifice and temple ritual that would develop over centuries. Before human beings had built the infrastructure of organized religion, before there were priests and ceremonies and sacred calendars, there was the ground. And the ground, if you knew how to listen, if you pressed your ear to it in the right places and the right states of mind, would tell you things. This was not metaphor to the ancient Greeks. It was understood as a literal fact of the world's structure. The earth knew. The earth remembered. and in certain places where the boundary between the deep world and the surface world grew thin, at volcanic vents, at caves that descended into darkness, at the roots of ancient trees, at springs that rose from far below with a coldness that spoke of depths unmeasured. The Earth's knowledge became accessible to those with the capacity to receive it. Gaia was also, in her quieter aspect, the sustainer of life, in the most fundamental sense that phrase can carry. Everything that grew from the soil grew from her. Every grain of wheat, every grape on every vine, every olive pressing its oil into the economy of the ancient Mediterranean world. All of it was her generosity, extended continuously, renewed with each season, taken for granted by those who had always had it, and understood with profound gratitude by those who had known what it was to go without. The ancient agricultural festivals that marked the Greek calendar were not simply celebrations of good harvests. They were acknowledgments of a debt, recognition that the food in the mouth had come from somewhere, from someone, from a presence that had not been asked whether it was willing to give and had given anyway. Farmers in the ancient world would speak to the earth before planting, would pour libations into the ground, wine or oil or water sent downward as a gift, before taking the first crop of the season. These were not the elaborate, architecturally spectacular rituals of the great Olympian temples. They were quiet, personal, conducted in open fields by ordinary people who had not forgotten that the ground beneath them was alive. The worship of Gaia, as practiced in the ancient world, was largely this kind of worship. Intimate, close to the body, conducted not in grand sanctuaries but in the places where human beings actually lived in daily contact with the earth. At the edges of fields, at the roots of ancient trees, at the threshold of homes, where a handful of soil placed beside the door spoke of a protection that no Olympian god could entirely replace. She received prayers for safe childbirth because she was the ground that received the newborn. She received prayers for the dead because she was what received the dead. She stood at both ends of human life, and in between she fed everything that lived. There were sanctuaries dedicated to her specifically in various parts of the ancient world. At Athens, an ancient altar to Gaia stood on the Acropolis, that sacred hill most associated now with Athena, but carrying beneath its more famous dedications the memory of older worship. At Olympia, the great sanctuary of Zeus, there was a precinct of Gaia remembered as among the most ancient sacred sites on the grounds. The oldest worship at Olympia, predating Zeus, predating the Olympic Games, reaching back to a time when the earth itself was what people brought their questions and their gratitude to. At Aigai and at Patrai and at various sites throughout the Peloponnese, her presence was marked and maintained. The oath sworn on Gaia was among the most binding available to the ancient Greeks. This is worth pausing on. In a world where oaths were the primary technology of trust, where contracts were enforced not by written law and courts but by the fear of divine retribution for breaking one's sworn word, the choice of which deity to invoke as witness was a serious decision. To swear by Zeus was powerful. To swear by the river Styx was, in some traditions, the most binding oath even for the gods themselves. But to swear by Gaia was to swear by the ground you stood on, to make the earth itself your witness. And the ancient Greeks understood, in a way that their descendants would spend considerable time forgetting and relearning, that you cannot deceive the ground. It is beneath every footstep. It receives every fallen thing. It holds everything that has ever happened on its surface in its deep memory, the way stone holds the impression of ancient life in its layers. Quietly, without drama, without the need to announce what it knows, she was called upon at moments of the most serious human need. When a city was being founded, libations went into the ground first. When a treaty was being sworn between peoples, the earth received the blood of sacrifice. When a mother feared for the life of her child, it was often to the ground she pressed her hands, not upward toward the sky gods, but downward, into the oldest relationship available to a human body, because the human body knows, even when the human mind has organized itself around other frameworks, other temples, other hierarchies of divine authority, that it came from the ground, that it will return to the ground, and that in between it is held up by something that has never, in all the long turning of the world, stopped being present beneath it.